On March 10, 1864, during the American Civil War, U.S. President Abraham Lincoln puts Ulysses S. Grant in charge of the Union Army. Grant was born in 1822 in Point Pleasant, Ohio. His father was a tanner and an abolitionist. Grant came from a family with a military tradition. His great-grandfather fought in the French and Indian War, and his grandfather fought at Bunker Hill during the American Revolution. Grant began attending the U.S. Military Academy at West Point in 1839. His name at birth was actually Hiram Ulysses Grant. He became Ulysses S. Grant due to an error by a benefactor on his application form to West Point. He tried to correct it upon entering, but was informed it would require a new appointment to the school. He would essentially have to start anew the acceptance process, so he tolerated the change. His new initials US led fellow cadets to nickname him Sam, as in Uncle Sam. The initials also turned out to be politically advantageous later in life, as US Grant is a rather patriotic name. He was an average student at West Point, graduating 21st out of 39 cadets. Conversely, his future battlefield foe Robert E. Lee, 15 years Grant's senior, was one of West Point's finest students and later became its commandant. Grant's roommate during his final year at West Point was Frederick Dent. After graduating, Grant was stationed at Jefferson Barracks near St. Louis, Missouri, near the Dent family plantation home. In 1844, Grant was invited to visit and met one of Dent's sisters, Julia. They fell in love and married 4 years later. At the same time Grant was courting Julia, he fought in the Mexican-American War under General Zachary Taylor, who would go on to become the 12th President of the United States in 1849. When the Civil War broke out in 1861, Grant was working at his father's leather store in Galena, Illinois. The state's governor appointed Grant to command a volunteer regiment. He rose quickly through the ranks of the Union Army. He won multiple victories in the West in his effort to gain control of the Mississippi Valley. After Grant's victory at the bloody 1862 Battle of Shiloh, Lincoln said of Grant, "I can't spare this man. He fights." Grant then took Vicksburg in the summer of 1863, cutting the Confederacy in two. In the fall of 1863, he won at Chattanooga. Meanwhile, Lincoln was struggling to find a competent commander in the East that could capitalize on the Union's built-in advantages and match up against the talented Confederate leaders. These difficulties in finding the right commander for the Union's Army of the Potomac are legendary. One of the biggest, and I think most deserved criticisms that can be leveled against Lincoln as president is this protracted effort to find a competent general to command the main Union Army. Lincoln finally, in 1864, settled on Grant, who ultimately led the Union to victory. If Lincoln had recognized Grant's potential sooner, it may have saved lives and ended the conflict more quickly. Let's run through some of those generals that preceded Grant. When the Civil War began, it was Irvin McDowell, who failed at Bull Run. Incidentally, McDowell Road in the Phoenix area is named after him. Then it was the notoriously cautious George McClellan, who effectively organized and trained the army, but refused to really use it unless he was thoroughly convinced that the odds were overwhelmingly in his favor. After McClellan's crucial victory at Antietam, he of course hesitated, missing an opportunity to potentially crush the Confederacy. McClellan also went on to run against Lincoln for president in 1864. Ambrose Burnside was next. He had epic facial hair, but that was about it. He oversaw disastrous defeats in Virginia at Fredericksburg and Petersburg. He was more successful in politics after the Civil War, serving as governor of Rhode Island and then as a U.S. Senator. Next came Joseph Hooker. Fightin' Joe, as he was known, got trounced by Lee at Chancellorsville. George Meade took over when Hooker resigned. Meade was short-tempered with his junior officers. His looks and obstinate demeanor caused him to be referred to as a damned old goggle-eyed snapping turtle. 3 days after his appointment, Meade won at Gettysburg, but squandered a golden opportunity to perhaps finish off Robert E. Lee's army of Northern Virginia. Lincoln finally found the leader he and the nation needed in Grant. The rank of lieutenant general, once held by George Washington, distinguished Grant as the commanding general of all Union forces. The Union Army finally had a leader in the same league as Lee. George Meade was still technically the commander of the Army of the Potomac, but by March 1864, Grant was directing Meade. Grant's strategy, determination, and ferocity led the Union Army to victory and Lee's surrender at Appomattox Courthouse. After the war, Grant served 2 terms as U.S. President from 1869 to 1877. He was easily elected because of his reputation from the Civil War. His presidency, however, was plagued by corruption within his administration. But Grant is also rightly praised for taking on the Ku Klux Klan, prosecuting members of his own party who were involved in the Whiskey Ring, and for his efforts to protect the rights of African Americans. In May 1877, a few months after leaving office as U.S. President, the Grants embarked on a 2-year world tour that would take them to Europe, Africa, the Middle East, India, and the Far East. They toured numerous famous sites. While visiting Naples, the Grants climbed Mount Vesuvius. They visited the Karnak Temple complex in Egypt and the Amber Palace in Rajasthan, India. They met with dignitaries like Britain's Queen Victoria, Tsar Alexander II of Russia, Catholic leader Pope Leo XIII, German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, and Ottoman Sultan Abdul Hamid II, who gifted Grant 2 Arabian stallions. In the Far East, the Grants met with King Chulalongkorn of Siam, Chinese statesman and diplomat Li Hongzhang, and Emperor Meiji of Japan. The Grants arrived back in the United States in San Francisco to a cheering crowd. The tour helped demonstrate that the U.S. was an emerging world power. In 1880, Grant quietly sought nomination for a 3rd term as U.S. President that would have broken the 2-term tradition established by George Washington. A contentious Republican convention took 36 ballots to settle on James Garfield as its nominee. Grant then publicly supported Garfield, helping him win the general election. Ulysses S. Grant died at age 63 in 1885, 20 years after Lee's surrender at Appomattox. Grant is laid to rest in a classical-styled mausoleum in the Morningside Heights neighborhood of Upper Manhattan in New York City. There's an old joke that used to be popular where a person would ask, "Who's buried in Grant's tomb?" I think I was introduced to this watching Looney Tunes as a kid. In any event, the answer to this question is not as straightforward as it would seem. The obvious answer is Grant, although you could say his wife Julia as well, since she is laid to rest beside him. Some believe the Grant's dog is there too, although there is no concrete evidence of that. You could also argue that no one is buried in Grant's tomb, since both Grant and Julia are not technically buried, but laid to rest in sarcophagi that are not underground. Here are other events that happened today in history. In 1876, the first discernible speech is transmitted over a telephone by inventor Alexander Graham Bell. In 1906, an underground fire sparks a massive explosion in a French coal mine, killing 1,000 workers. In 1959, 300,000 Tibetans revolt against China, which had invaded and occupied the territory in 1950. In 1970, the U.S. Army charges 5 soldiers with committing war crimes during the My Lai massacre in Vietnam. In 1988, disco heartthrob Andy Gibb, younger brother of the Bee Gees, dies at age 30 of a heart condition. In 2019, Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302 crashes due to a computer issue on the Boeing 737 MAX plane. In 2023, Silicon Valley Bank collapses in the second largest bank failure in United States history. And now it's time for our Today in History quiz. Where was the first known St. Patrick's Day parade held? Boston, Massachusetts, Dublin, Ireland, St. Augustine, Florida, or Derry, Northern Ireland? Think you know the answer? Drop your guesses in the comments below. Find out if you're right next time on Today in History.